The California sun was always a bit too much for him, a bright, demanding spotlight he'd learned to both use and hide from. On this particular Tuesday, however, it felt especially aggressive. Keanu Reeves pulled his helmet off, the leather creaking in the quiet air of the parking garage. He was here to visit a place called the Havenwood Wellness Center, a name that sounded more like a spa than a state-of-the-art facility for children with severe medical conditions. His agent had set it up, suggesting it would be a good look, a way to give back. But for Keanu, it was something else. It was a search for a piece of the world that felt real, a world that wasn't framed by a camera lens or filtered through public opinion. He was tired of the noise, and he thought, perhaps, he might find some quiet here. The inside of Havenwood was the opposite of the glare outside. It was cool and hushed, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic mixed with the subtle, sweet scent of gardenias from a large arrangement in the lobby. The floors were polished to a high gloss, and the sound of his shoes seemed too loud, echoing softly off the walls. A woman with a kind face and a tired smile greeted him. She was the director, and she led him down a long hallway, pointing out the art therapy room, the solarium built with special filtered glass, and the small, intimate classrooms. Keanu nodded along, trying to absorb it all, but he felt like a tourist. The children they passed were fragile, some in wheelchairs, others with tubes trailing behind them, but they all had a spark in their eyes. They were living, breathing, fighting. He admired them immensely. As the tour was winding down, the director stopped at a quieter, more secluded wing of the building. Her demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more reserved. "There's one child. A very special case," she began, her voice lowering. "Her name is Ilara. She's 14. Keanu waited, sensing this was the reason he'd felt so compelled to come. The director explained that Ilara had an incredibly rare genetic disorder, a condition that made her skin and eyes violently react to any form of light. Not just sunlight, but lamplight, even the glow from a digital clock. To survive, she had to exist in a world of complete, total darkness. Her room was a black hole, a space sealed off from the rest of the world. The physical side is one thing," the director continued, choosing her words with care. "We can manage the environment, but there's something else. Ilara, she doesn't speak. She hasn't spoken a word in over 7 years. The trauma of her early treatments, combined with the profound isolation, it created a wall around her. The nurses, they have a name for her, something they only say amongst themselves. They call her the vampire girl." The name hung in the air, a sad, clumsy label for a child's unimaginable reality. A familiar weight settled in Keanu's chest. It was an old feeling, one that surfaced when he encountered deep, unspoken pain. He thought of his own sister, her long battle with illness, the helplessness he often felt. He thought of his own private losses, the moments of silence that had stretched into years. This girl, Ilara, was living in a silence he could only imagine. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of connection, of a shared world. He felt a pull, a strange and powerful current drawing him toward her darkened room. It wasn't pity. It was something more like recognition. He looked at the director, his voice soft but firm. "I'd like to meet her," he said. The director looked hesitant, but she saw the sincerity in his eyes. She nodded slowly. "All right, but there are rules. No sudden movements. No strong smells. Your phone must be completely off. And when we go in, it will be pitch black. You won't see her, and she won't see you. You'll only be able to be there." He understood completely. This wasn't a performance. This was an offering of presence. They walked down another hallway, this one even quieter. The air grew cooler, stiller. The director stopped in front of a solid-looking door, unlike the others in the facility. It had a special seal around the edges to block out any light. She turned a heavy handle and pushed it open, not stepping inside herself, but simply holding it for him. "I'll be right here," she whispered. Keanu took a breath and stepped through the doorway. The transition was immediate and absolute. It wasn't just darkness. It was a void. It was a complete and total lack of visual information. so profound that his brain scrambled to create shapes that weren't there. The air inside was cool and still, carrying only the faintest scent of clean linen. He stood perfectly still, letting his other senses reach out. And then he heard it. A soft, steady rhythm, the sound of breathing. In and out. In and out. It was the only sign that he was not alone in this endless black space. His eyes began to adjust. Or perhaps his mind did, and he slowly made out a faint shape. It was a bed, and on it an even smaller, stiller form. He couldn't see features or hair or clothes. It was just a silhouette against a slightly less black background. He felt like an intruder, a giant from the world of light stumbling into a sacred, secret place. He didn't want to frighten her. He slowly lowered himself to the floor, his back against the wall, not far from the door. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, sharing her silence, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breath. He thought about what it must be like to have this be your entire universe. The darkness wasn't an absence of life for her. It was the very condition of it. After a long while, when he felt the silence had settled around him like a blanket, he spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, a soft puff of air in the dense quiet. "Hi," he said. There was no change in the rhythm of the breathing. He hadn't expected there to be. "My name is Keanu," he continued, his tone gentle and even. I was in the neighborhood. The director told me about this quiet place. I thought I'd come sit in the quiet for a bit, if that's okay." He wasn't asking a question. He was stating his intention, offering her the choice to accept or reject his presence. The response was the same as before. A heavy, complete silence that was somehow louder than any sound he had ever heard. It wasn't a hostile silence or an empty one. It was a deep, ancient silence, a wall built brick by brick over years of solitude. He sat there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 15 minutes. He didn't try to talk again. He just breathed with her, in and out, a silent rhythm in the dark. He realized then that this wasn't a problem to be solved or a person to be fixed. This was a world to be respected, a universe of darkness that he was a guest in. He finally pushed himself up quietly, his joints stiff, and backed out of the room, pulling the door softly closed behind him. The director was still there, her expression questioning. He just shook his head slightly, a small, sad smile on his face. He didn't need to say anything. She understood. As he walked away, he knew one thing for certain. He would be back. The following week, Keanu found himself riding his motorcycle toward Havenwood again. It wasn't a scheduled visit. His agent hadn't set it up. It was just something he felt he had to do. The roar of the engine, the wind rushing past him, it all felt like part of a different world. A world of noise and light he was temporarily leaving behind. He felt a strange sense of peace about it. This wasn't about charity or public image anymore. It was about a girl in a dark room, and the quiet space they were beginning to build together. When he arrived, the director seemed surprised but genuinely pleased to see him. She didn't ask any questions, simply nodding as he made his way down the now familiar, hushed hallway to the sealed door. He stepped into the void. The darkness was just as absolute as before, a thick, heavy blanket. He could hear the soft, steady rhythm of Ilara's breathing, a quiet metronome marking the time in her silent world. He sat down in his usual spot on the floor, his back against the cool wall. For a long time, he just sat there, breathing with her, letting the silence settle around them. He didn't want to rush. He wanted her to know he was here for the quiet, not just to fill it. After a while, he spoke, his voice a low murmur. "Hi, Ilara. It's me again, Keanu." He paused. "I brought you something today." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, smooth, dark river stone he'd found on a hike. He held it in his palm, describing it to her. "It's from a creek up in the mountains. The water has been rushing over it for probably 1,000 years, making it all smooth and soft. It's cool to the touch." He didn't try to give it to her. He just placed it gently on the knitstand, a small offering from the world outside. Then he began to read. He brought a collection of poems, not simple ones, but poems about stars and oceans and the vastness of the human heart. He read slowly, his voice a calm, steady current in the stillness. He didn't know if she was listening, but he read as if she were hanging on every word. This became their ritual. He would visit 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Each time he would bring a small piece of the outside world. A handkerchief that smelled of pine needles from the forest. A piece of soft velvety moss. A seashell he held to her ear so she could hear the faint, hollow whisper of the ocean inside. He never pressured her to touch them or react. He just presented them, described them, and then left them there. A small collection of textures and scents slowly growing on her knitstand. He was building a world for her, one tiny piece at a time. Mostly, though, he brought his voice. He read philosophy, old plays, and adventure stories. But he also just talked. He found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone. He talked about feeling lonely in a crowded room, about the strangeness of seeing his face on a giant screen, about the simple joy of riding his motorcycle on an open road. He shared his own vulnerabilities, his own moments of darkness, not to compare them to hers, but to show her that everyone, in their own way, has to navigate the dark. He wasn't a celebrity visiting a patient. He was just a man sharing his story with a girl in the hope that she might one day share hers. Weeks turned into a month. The silence in the room remained, but it had changed. It was no longer an empty, intimidating void. It had become a companionable silence, a space filled with unspoken understanding. He could feel her presence more strongly now, a focused point of awareness in the blackness. He would sometimes pause while reading, and he could feel her listening, her attention a tangible thing. The wall was still there, but he felt like he was slowly chipping away at it, not with a hammer, but with the gentle, persistent drip of water. Then, one evening, something shifted. He was reading a passage from an old novel about a character looking up at the night sky, feeling both infinitely small and deeply connected to the universe. The words were beautiful, and he got lost in them, his voice soft and full of wonder. And he felt that the silence of the stars was not an emptiness, but a kind of music, a promise that he was not alone. As he finished the sentence, he felt it. A light, hesitant brush against the back of his hand, which was resting on the floor beside him. He froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. He kept his hand perfectly still. It was the lightest of touches, like the wing of a moth. A small, cool finger tracing a line across his knuckles. It lasted for no more than a few seconds, and then it was gone. He didn't say a word. He didn't acknowledge it. He simply closed his eyes, took a quiet breath, and continued reading, his voice a little thicker, a little more unsteady than before. When he left the room that night, he leaned against the closed door for a long time, a wide, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. It was the smallest of gestures, but it felt like a seismic event. The wall had cracked. A couple of weeks later, the crack widened. He was telling her a story, trying to describe something that was hard to put into words. He was telling her about his motorcycle. It's this machine, right? All metal and power. And when you start it up, the whole thing comes to life. It's not just a sound you hear with your ears, it's a feeling you get in your whole body. A deep rumble that vibrates right up through your spine. He paused, trying to think of how to explain it better. It's a powerful sound. It fills up everything. He sat in the quiet that followed, letting his description hang in the air. He expected the usual silence. But this time it was different. From the direction of the bed, a sound came. It was small and rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in a very long time. A single, whispered word, loud. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see her, but he could feel her waiting. He didn't want to scare her, didn't want to make a big deal out of it and have her retreat back into her shell. He just swallowed hard and whispered back into the darkness, his voice full of a gentle, overwhelming awe. Yeah, it is. He didn't say anything else for the rest of his visit. He just sat there with her in the dark, the single word echoing in his mind. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. When he finally left, he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. The silence was broken. Not by a shout, but by a whisper. And in that quiet, dark room, a whole new world had just begun. The word loud changed everything. It was a tiny, fragile thing, a single syllable whispered in the dark, but to Keanu it was an explosion. It was the first sign of life from a world that had been silent for so long. His visits after that felt different, charged with a new kind of energy. He was no longer just a visitor bringing gifts from the outside. He was a conversation partner. The silence was no longer a wall to be patiently chipped away at, but a space waiting to be filled. He found himself thinking about Ilara constantly, wondering what she was thinking, what she was experiencing in her velvet black world. He would find himself at a stoplight on his motorcycle, and instead of feeling the impatience of the city, he would close his eyes for a second and try to imagine the world through her senses. The rumble of the engine not just as a sound, but as a vibration in the bones, the smell of exhaust fumes and rain-soaked asphalt. The feeling of the wind. Their communication grew, slowly and carefully, like a plant reaching for the sun it couldn't see. It became a game between them. He would bring an object and describe it, and she would have to guess what it was. "Okay," he'd say one afternoon, his voice full of playful conspiracy. "This one is rough. It feels like a tiny, dried-up mountain range. And it smells like a forest floor after it rains." He held out a piece of bark from an old pine tree. There would be a long pause, filled only by the sound of her thinking, a soft rustle of her bedsheets. Then another whisper. "Tree?" He would grin, even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, you got it. It's from a pine tree." These small victories felt monumental. He learned she loved the smell of citrus, the feel of cold metal, and the sound of crickets, which he played for her from a small, shielded speaker. He was learning the language of her world, a language built on scent, texture, and sound. As their bond deepened, so did his curiosity about the life she had lived before this room. He started noticing things he hadn't before. On her nightstand, next to the river stone and the seashell, was a small, silver-framed photograph. It was the only thing in the room that felt truly personal, that spoke of a history before Havenwood. But it was always turned face down. He felt a powerful urge to flip it over, to see the faces that might give him a clue to her past. But he never did. It felt like a violation, a betrayal of the trust she was slowly placing in him. It was her story to tell, or not to tell, and he had to respect that. Still, the image in that frame became a symbol of the mystery that surrounded her. He tried to ask questions, but in the gentlest way he could. One afternoon, while refilling the water pitcher by her bed, he spoke casually to the head nurse, a woman named Clara, whose presence was as comforting as a warm blanket. "She's so brave," Keanu said, keeping his voice low. "Her family must be incredibly proud." Clara smiled, but it was a careful, practiced smile. "We have the utmost admiration for all our families," she replied, her tone polite but final. Keanu tried again another day. "Her mother must be an amazing woman," he said, "to have found a place like this, to make sure she has everything she needs." Clara's expression softened slightly, a flicker of something genuine in her eyes. "Ilara's mother is very dedicated," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She would do anything for her daughter." Then just as quickly the professional wall was back up. "Now, can I get you another cup of coffee, Mr. Reeves?" He knew he wouldn't get any more from Clara. Her loyalty was to the child and her family, and he respected that, even as it left him with more questions than answers. He did learn one small, tantalizing clue. He was waiting for Clara one day near the main reception desk when he overheard her on the phone discussing billing. "Yes, everything is covered," she said, sounding a little weary. "Just send the invoice to the usual address. It's all handled by SB's office?" SB, just two initials. They echoed in his mind, a puzzle with 1,000 possible solutions and no way to know which one was right. The mystery of the mother became a quiet hum in the background of his visits. A question he held in his mind as he read to Ilara or described the taste of a ripe strawberry. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything again. He had stayed later than usual. Ilara had been particularly talkative for her, stringing together 2 and even 3 words at a time. "Cold," stone. Smooth, she had said, touching the river stone. He felt so elated, so connected to her that he didn't want the day to end. After he left her room, he just stood in the quiet hallway for a while, leaning against the wall, replaying their conversations in his head. The facility was emptying out for the night, the sounds of the day fading into a peaceful hush. Most of the staff had gone home, and the long corridor was bathed in the dim emergency lighting from a nearby office. A door he hadn't noticed before, he heard the muffled sound of a conversation. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the tones of two voices, one serious, one something else. Then the serious voice said something that must have been funny because the other voice let out a laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was unmistakable. It was a bright, slightly raspy, utterly familiar sound that cut through the quiet of the hallway and went straight through him like a bolt of lightning. Keanu froze. His breath caught in his throat. It was a laugh he hadn't heard in over 20 years. A sound that was tied to a very specific time in his life. A time of long nights on movie sets, of whispered jokes between takes, of a connection that had been intense and private and had ended as their careers were just beginning to explode. It was a laugh that belonged to a ghost, a beautiful, vibrant ghost from his past. He couldn't place a name to it right away. His mind was too stunned, too busy trying to process the shock. All he knew was that he knew that laugh better than he knew his own sometimes. It was the sound of a shared secret, of a moment of pure, unguarded joy. He stood there, completely still, his heart pounding in his chest as the laugh faded and the office door clicked shut. The hallway was silent again, but the silence was now filled with an echo. The mystery of Alara's mother, the ghost from his own past, the two initials, SB. Suddenly, they all felt tangled together, threads of a story he was only just beginning to unravel. He had come to this place looking for quiet, and instead he had stumbled into a storm. The laugh echoed in his mind long after he left the quiet hallway of Havenwood. It followed him home, a ghost in the passenger seat of his car, a whisper in the silence of his empty house. He tried to shake it, to logic it away. It was a coincidence. Millions of people in the world, surely more than one of them had a laugh like that, bright, a little bit raspy, full of life. But he knew better. It was like a song you haven't heard in 20 years but can still recall every note to. It was her laugh. He was sure of it. The thought was so absurd, so impossible, that he pushed it away, but it kept creeping back in, especially when the house was dark and quiet. He found himself replaying memories he hadn't thought of in ages. Not big, dramatic moments, but small sensory details. The way she used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The smell of the coffee she used to drink, black with 2 sugars. The feel of her hand in his as they walked through a cold New York winter, their breath fogging in front of them. They had been young, their lives just beginning to spiral into the stratosphere of fame. They had promised each other they wouldn't let it change them, a promise that had been both sincere and impossible to keep. Their romance had been a bright, intense fire, and it had burned out quickly but cleanly, leaving behind the warm glow of a fond memory, not the ash of regret. They had wished each other well and gone their separate ways, 2 ships passing in the vast, impersonal ocean of Hollywood. Now, that laugh had pulled him back to that shore. The initials SB floated in his mind again, SB, the dedicated mother, the secret benefactor. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know he was solving were suddenly sliding into place, and the picture they were forming was one he couldn't comprehend. It felt too big, too strange to be real. His next visit to Alara was a few days later. The sky was a moody, overcast gray, matching the turbulence inside him. As he walked down the hallway, he found himself glancing toward the office where he'd heard the laugh. The door was closed. He felt a nervous energy he hadn't felt in years, a jittery feeling that was completely at odds with the calm, quiet space he shared with Alara when he stepped into her room. The familiar darkness felt different, charged with a new tension. He sat down, but he couldn't settle. Alara seemed to sense it. Her breathing, usually a soft, steady rhythm, was a little quicker. He could feel her awareness, her quiet curiosity. He took a deep breath, trying to push his own turmoil aside. He was here for her. Hey, he said, his voice softer than usual. Sorry, I'm a bit all over the place today. He didn't know why he was apologizing, but it felt right. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I brought you something new, he said, trying to find his normal rhythm. He tipped the contents into his palm. It was a small brass bell, the kind you might find on an old-fashioned desk. It's a bell, he explained. It makes a very gentle sound. Not loud like the motorcycle, more like a whisper. He gently shook it, and a soft, clear chime filled the darkness. It was a lovely, delicate sound. He held it out in her direction, offering it to her. For a moment there was only silence. Then he felt the familiar, light touch of her fingers as they explored his palm. Her small hand brushed against his, and then her fingers closed around the bell. He heard the soft jingle as she took it from him. She was quiet for a long time, and he just waited. Then she shook it herself. A single soft chime, whisper, she said, her voice clear in the dark. Yeah, he whispered back, his heart swelling. A whisper. He felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost took his breath away. This incredible girl, trapped in her silent world, was learning to speak, learning to connect, and he was a part of it. In that moment, his own confusion and shock felt selfish. This was what mattered. This connection. He was about to say something else, to tell her how proud he was. When the door to the room opened quietly, it wasn't unusual for a nurse to peek in, but this felt different. A silhouette stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the hall. The person was still, just watching. Keanu's heart started to pound again, the same frantic rhythm from the other night. The figure stepped inside, closing the door softly, plunging the room back into near-total darkness. Keanu could just make out the shape of a woman, her posture one of exhaustion and love as she looked toward the bed. "Ilara?" the woman's voice said. It was a voice full of gentle concern, a voice that was unmistakably hers. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see her face, but he didn't need to. The voice, the presence, the laugh, it all slammed into him at once. It was her. It was Sandra. He must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because her head snapped in his direction. She had no idea he was there. In the dimness, he could see her eyes widen in shock. She stared at him, a man sitting on the floor of her daughter's secret room, and he stared back at her. The years fell away, and they were just two young people again, thrown into a situation so bizarre it felt like a dream. "You?" She breathed, the word barely audible. It was a question full of a decade's worth of unspoken history. He couldn't speak. He just nodded slowly, his mind reeling. His eyes darted from her to the bed where Ilara was sitting up now, the small bell still in her hand. Ilara, who had his eyes. He saw it then, in the shape of her face, the quiet intensity of her gaze. It was so obvious he couldn't believe he hadn't seen it before. Sandra looked from him to her daughter, and a kind of desperate understanding dawned on her face. She saw the way he was looking at Ilara, saw the connection, the history. She saw that the secret she had protected with her life was out, not in a tabloid headline, but in the most intimate, unimaginable way possible. Her shoulders slumped, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She walked slowly to the bed and sat on the edge, her movements heavy with the weight of what was about to be said. We lost touch," she began, her voice trembling slightly, not looking at him but at her daughter's hand. "And then, a few weeks later, I realized. I knew. I was so scared. My life was becoming this circus. Cameras everywhere, people judging every choice I made. And then I found out about you," she said, her voice cracking as she looked at Ilara. "And about the darkness you would have to live in. All I could think was that I couldn't let that world, my world, touch you. I couldn't let them turn you into a headline, a curiosity. I had to protect you." She finally turned to look at Keanu, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "It was the most agonizing choice of my life. But I made it. I found this place. I made a deal with them, a few people I trusted, and I built a world for her here. A small, safe, quiet world. I'm here every night after everyone is gone. I am her mother. but SB is her benefactor. I never thought, I never imagined. She trailed off, the confession hanging in the thick, dark air. Keanu felt a storm of emotions, shock, confusion, a strange sense of loss for years he never knew he had, but overriding all of it was a profound, aching empathy. He looked at this woman, this mother, who had carried an impossible secret for so long, all to protect her child. He understood. He completely understood. He didn't feel anger or betrayal. He just felt the immense, heartbreaking weight of her love. Before he could say anything, he felt a small hand touch his arm. It was Ilara. She had reached out to him. Then, with her other hand, she reached out for her mother. In the complete darkness of that room, the girl who had been silent for most of her life connected the two people from her past, creating a bridge between them with a simple, human touch. The secret was out, and in its place, something new and fragile and terribly real was just beginning. The silence in the room was no longer a wall. It was a blanket. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft, shared breaths of the three people connected by a secret that had just been unwrapped in the most gentle, most shocking way. Keanu could feel the small, cool weight of Ilara's hand on his arm, a silent anchor in the storm of his own thoughts. His other hand was close to Sandra's on the bed, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. He looked at Ilara, at the shape of her face in the gloom, and it was like looking at a photograph he'd never seen but somehow always remembered. The truth of it settled over him, not like a lightning strike, but like a slow, deep tide. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. He finally broke the quiet, his voice just a soft rasp in the darkness. He began, looking at Sandra, but the words caught in his throat. He cleared it and tried again. You must have been so alone? It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. He saw the years of struggle, the weight of a world carried on her shoulders. All for the small, still figure on the bed. Sandra let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 14 years. It was a shaky, shuddering sound. A tear escaped, and she quickly wiped it away. I had her, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. That was all that mattered. She looked at Keanu then, her eyes searching his in the dim light, looking for judgment, for anger, for something. But all she found was a quiet, profound understanding. He wasn't the man from the movies. He was just a man, sitting on the floor of a dark room, looking at the daughter he never knew he had. You did the right thing, he said, and the simple words seemed to lift a mountain from her soul. You gave her a safe place. You kept the world away. I get it. I really do. He thought of his own life, the constant noise, the lack of privacy. He wouldn't have wished that on anyone, let alone a child as fragile as Ilara. He saw her choice not as a betrayal, but as the ultimate act of love. In that moment, something shifted between them. The past, with its youthful romance and what-ifs, faded completely. It was irrelevant. They were no longer two ex-lovers who had shared a brief, intense chapter of their lives. They were two parents, bound together by a quiet, extraordinary girl. There was no awkwardness, no talk of rekindling anything. That ship had sailed a long time ago. This was something new, something stronger. It was a partnership forged in darkness. The change was immediate. Keanu didn't stop visiting, but his visits became different. Sometimes he would arrive to find Sandra already there, sitting on the edge of the bed, telling Ilara stories about her day in a soft, animated voice. She didn't hide anymore. Keanu would just slip into the room, take his place on the floor, and join the quiet circle. They started to coordinate, a silent team working to expand Ilara's universe. He would bring the textures and sounds of the outside world, and Sandra would bring the context, the stories that wove them all together. One day, Keanu brought a small, shielded tablet, preloaded with nature documentaries. He put the headphones gently over Ilara's ears. This is the ocean, he said. Listen. He pressed play. Ilara's face, usually so still and passive, changed. Her eyes widened, and a small, amazed smile touched her lips. She could hear the crashing of waves, the cry of seagulls, the deep, rumbling song of a whale. It was a world she had never experienced. "Well," she whispered, pulling the headphones off slightly. "Yeah," Sandra said, smiling at Keanu over Ilara's head. "A big one." Ilara's progress accelerated. With two people to talk to, two sources of love and attention, her world felt richer, safer. She started stringing more words together. One evening, as Keanu was describing the taste of a chocolate he'd brought, she surprised them both. "You? Like, chocolate?" she asked, her voice clear and curious. It was the first question she had ever asked. It wasn't just a response. It was an inquiry into his world, a desire to know him better. Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Sandra, who had tears in her eyes, but she was nodding, encouraging him. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I really, really like chocolate." They never talked about telling the world. It was an unspoken agreement, a sacred pact. This was their sanctuary. The headlines, the cameras, the chaos of their public lives, it had no place here. This room, with its pitch-black darkness and its profound quiet, was the realest place any of them had ever been. Keanu would sometimes arrive at the facility and see his face on a magazine cover in the gift shop, and it would feel like looking at a picture of a stranger. That man lived in a world of light. He lived in this one now, too. The story didn't end with a grand gesture or a public announcement. It ended, or perhaps began, on a quiet, rainy Tuesday. Keanu and Sandra decided to do something normal, something families do. They brought a small projector and a portable screen into Ilara's room, setting it up at the foot of her bed. The light from the projector was dim and carefully shielded, casting a soft, flickering glow on the ceiling. A gentle imitation of a moonlit night. They put on an old, black-and-white movie. The three of them settled in. Sandra sat on one side of the bed, her arm draped protectively around her daughter. Keanu sat on the other, close enough that Ilara could rest her head against his shoulder. The room was filled with the soft, crackling dialogue of the old film and the gentle sound of rain tapping against the windowpane, a sound Ilara had never heard before. Keanu looked down at Ilara, whose face was illuminated by the dancing light from the screen. She was completely captivated, a small smile on her lips. He looked across the bed at Sandra, who met his gaze. In the soft glow, she looked tired, but there was a peace on her face that hadn't been there before. The secret was out that the world hadn't ended. It had just gotten bigger. He reached over and gently took Sandra's hand. She squeezed his back. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a gesture of partnership, of shared purpose. They were three separate people, a movie star, a beloved actress, and a girl who lived in the dark. But in that room, watching an old movie in the soft light, they were just a family. A new, unconventional constellation, shining brightly in a world of their own making. And the silence that had once been Ilara's prison had finally become their home.